Tonight in Greater Boston, it's our annual year in review, although like the one before it, 2021 has felt more like a decade. With an attempt at insurrection, yes, that was this year, a second Trump impeachment, new COVID waves, and even more variants. Partisan gridlock and infighting in D.C., major Supreme Court cases, murder trials, billionaires in space for some reason, and plenty more. But since we don't have time to get to it all, we're focusing on some of the through lines of the year that will have the biggest impact on next year, from systemic racism and inequity to steps towards progress and accountability, and the political dysfunction that's plagued the Democrats' control of D.C. Some of the racial flashpoints of last year, including the murder of George Floyd, which sparked one of, if not the biggest protest movement in U.S. history, culminated in some measure of accountability this year.
Guilty, guilty, guilty.
Ex-Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 22 years in prison for the murder of George Floyd. Earlier this month, he pled guilty to federal charges for violating Floyd's civil rights as well. And the men who chased Ahmaud Arbery, one of whom shot and killed him during a struggle he admits he initiated, were also held accountable for his murder. But real justice is still a long way away, in part evidenced by the criminal trial of Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager who killed two Black Lives Matter protesters last year with an assault rifle he was too young to have and still got off scot-free. And then there's the spotlight COVID is shining directly on the racial divide. After starting off the year with wildly uneven vaccine distribution numbers and white people in Massachusetts having gotten close to 36% of all vaccine doses by the end of January, compared with less than 3 and 4% of Black and Hispanic people, respectively, we find ourselves in much the same place in the latest phase of the vaccine rollout almost a year later, with more than half of white 5 to 11-year-olds in Boston having gotten their first shot, compared with 8 and 6% of Latino and Black kids, respectively. We are nothing if not consistent. I'm joined now by a man who knows a thing or two about that issue, along with a few others, Michael Curry. He's the president and CEO of the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers, chair of the National NAACP Advocacy and Policy Committee, and one of the Boston Globe's 2021 Bostonians of the Year. Michael, good to see you. Nancy Gertner is a retired federal judge and senior lecturer at Harvard Law School. Judge Gertner, it's good to see you as well. Thank you both for being here.
Good to be back.
Judge, if I can start with you, did the convictions of Chauvin and the two McMichaels and Bryan, the three people responsible for the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, change anything, or are these just examples of, standalone accountability?
Well, I think the reverse would have been true. The failure to convict would have been substantial. The failure to convict Chauvin, the failure to convict the killers of Ahmaud Arbery. I think the problem here is that racial attitudes are embedded in jury trials. And when the law invites a jury to decide whether the force was reasonable, whether self-defense was reasonable under the circumstances, essentially all of the stereotypes that we walk around with flood in. And that's the problem. That was the reason, I think, for the Rittenhouse verdict, in addition to the fact that the judge put his thumb on the scale. So it's where we play out all the stereotypes.
I want to go to a couple of people on the street, Michael, before I get to you with their thoughts on the Chauvin verdict. Here they are.
I was happy when George Floyd's killer was prosecuted, but I do think that this was an isolated incident.
My sense on it is this happens constantly, and I don't feel a change, not yet. But I feel like there is some understanding in what the problem is, but the solution is not yet been.
Is there a change, Michael Curry?
I think the consciousness is coming. I think there's something to be hopeful for. But as I spent this morning looking at the trial transcript from the Tamir Rice killing in the 1950s, and I was looking at the language that really characterized Tamir Rice as a grown man, right? And we saw that sort of play out with Tamir Rice. Emmett Till. We saw that play out with Tamir Rice. We saw how you would characterize Trayvon Martin and many others. So I think the reality is we still see the same tropes, the same stereotypes. And as the judge says, still the same taint of race in our justice system. I'll be teaching a class at New England Law Boston on race and the law in the spring, and we'll be taking up some of these issues.
You know, Michael, I want to stay with you because of what you do in your day job. Obviously, nothing good comes from 800,000 deaths from COVID in this country. However, it did shine a very bright light on the health inequities you deal with in your job every single day. But you believe it also shined a light on a broader set of things. And you have proposed on the city level, on the state level, and I think on the federal level, almost a reparations-like approach to these problems that goes well beyond healthcare. Is anybody paying attention, or are we all just talk and no walk?
You know, Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first African-American physician in the later part of the 19th century, said they seem to forget that there's a cause for every ailment and it may be in their power to remove it. She was talking about social determinants of health back in the late 1800s. We now know that if you are in communities where you're living 10 to 15 years less, if you're Black and brown, if you're more likely to be infected, hospitalized, and die of COVID, this was always the case. This was always about those closest to the pain, to disease, to poverty, not having adequate housing, food, or access to healthcare or primary care providers. So whether we actually, Jim, are ready, willing, and able to start addressing these issues, I'm optimistic. I'm hearing it more from government officials. I'm hearing it more from advocates. So now we just have to seize the opportunity.
You know, speaking of optimism, Judge Gertner, if this show had been done, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, I would have said to you, how can you not be optimistic on these issues? Rachel Rollins was just confirmed as the first Black U.S. attorney from Massachusetts. Michelle Wu was just elected as the first woman, first person of color as mayor of Boston. But then Rachel Rollins was on TV with me about 10 days ago talking about what she had to experience after she was brutalized by Republicans during her confirmation hearing. And then just today, Michelle Wu was with us on the radio talking about what she experienced as a result of her vaccine mandate decision announced yesterday. Here's Rollins and then Wu.
A lot of people don't recognize, as women and as women of color, and particularly as a Black woman, the level of racist, hate-filled death threats that we receive. My security team is fielding calls with people using the N-word and saying they want to put a bullet in my head. And, you know, they know I have children.
Every time I open my phone, it's another dozen hateful messages. There's constant calls associating me with the same hateful, racist, xenophobic language that the former president used in describing the virus and its origins and who was to blame. And unfortunately, this isn't something that I bear alone. I know I can count on more than one hand the number of women of color, elected officials in Massachusetts who have experienced similar hatred, similar protests at events.
You know, Judge Gertner, I don't even know what to ask. All I know is this is not Charlottesville. It's not Glynn County, Georgia. This is Boston, Massachusetts. What's your reaction to what you heard from Mayor Wu and U.S. Attorney-to-be Rachel Rollins?
First, Rachel wasn't the first Black U.S. attorney. Wayne Budd was the first Black
No,
US
woman,
attorney.
I'm sorry. Black woman U.S. Attorney, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I think there are a couple of things. I mean, Trump gave permission for people to say out loud what they had never said out loud before. The Republican Party has given permission for people to say that. Fox News has given permission, and social media has enabled it. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't the same attitudes lurking before, but the level of the extent to which people feel comfortable talking like this is something completely different. So I don't know whether it is, dramatic change, or whether this is surfacing what people muttered before. I don't know. And there's one thing I want to watch with both respect to Mayor Wu and Rachel Rollins. I want to see how the Globe in particular covers them, because what happens is that U.S. attorneys in the past have gotten a pass, literally gotten a pass for the most part, except for women. Male U.S. attorneys got a pass. I want to see how they're going to cover what Rachel Rollins is trying to do. And it's the same thing with Mayor Wu. And that might affect the other attitudes out there. But we've given permission to say this stuff out loud in ways that are horrifying.
Did this surprise you, Michael Curry?
Not at all. I think, I've talked to NAACP colleagues across the country, and they tell you that if you're in the South and people are overt with their racism, that they don't like Boston because people have a sort of a fake liberalism here, and they think that they're allies and open to race issues, but they're not. We know that there are pockets of communities across the Commonwealth that people still harbor hate, they have racial animus, and they show up in our classrooms, in our police departments, and in our medical facilities. They exist. So, part of this is just knowing the truth about ourselves, right? Ourselves as a city, ourselves as a country. Racism has always been here. And as the judge said, it was unbridled by the former president. Now we can't put it back in the box. People feel empowered to really say what they think. And I actually prefer that because now that we know what you think, we can now vote you out. We can now remove you from positions where you can hurt our children and make bad policy. So I want to know who you are, and then I want to go after you and get rid of you. Because quite frankly, they're here.
Tell that to 70 million people who voted for the losing candidate in the last presidential election. Let's stay in Massachusetts. Of course, there was another big announcement this year that set the stage for the year to come in Massachusetts politics.
There is a ton of work that's left to be done as we come out of this pandemic, and we believe it's most important that we spend the next year focusing on that and not focusing on, let's call it the discourse, and that's probably an insult to the word discourse, that comes with political campaigning.
So with Charlie Baker out, that leaves former state rep Jeff Deal on the Republican side. As for the Democrats, longtime state senator Sonia Chang-Diaz, Harvard professor Danielle Allen, former state senator Ben Downing, officially with Attorney General Maura Healey expected to announce her decision any day. And then, of course, there's Labor Secretary Marty Walsh. Michael, starting with you, you've worked pretty closely with Governor Baker on these COVID issues. You're on his advisory committee, that sort of thing. Jeff Deal was the co-chair of the Trump campaign in Massachusetts in 2016. There are virtually no Republicans in the legislature. Even if a Democrat who you thought was terrific was elected governor in November, are you troubled by not one-party control, but total one-party control in a state like Massachusetts?
Yeah, I'm not troubled by it. I think, for us in Massachusetts, we don't tend to be as divided as a state government as we see in other parts of the country, right? We can come together and tackle some real serious issues. And I've worked with Republicans in the state legislature on some really critical health and social justice issues. So I think what concerns me most is that we be bold enough not to try to measure ourselves against other states, but to lead. And we in Massachusetts tend to have that attitude that we want to lead. We want to talk about the use of those ARPA dollars to move the needle on some critical issues. And I think the legislature, to their credit, did that.
I think, Judge Gertner, that the voters of Massachusetts historically have not agreed with Michael Curry. My analysis of why we've had a large number of Republican governors, beyond the fact that people may have liked him on the merits, is people wanted to check, I believe, on an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature. Are you troubled by the state being run? We don't know if this is the outcome, but it's probably a likely one, that this be an all Democratic government infrastructure in the state?
If the Democratic Party was a monolith, I would be troubled, but it's not. It's really not. I mean, it's the classic view that it's a big tent, and it really is. And we've had moderate Democrats, moderate left Democrats. So I'm not troubled by that. And one of the things that Baker's not running for office again does is sort of what happened when Marty Walsh stepped down too. It has opened the field to not just Democratic candidates, but women, people of color, et cetera. That's phenomenal. So I'm not troubled if the outcome of that is, a more free-for-all electoral process where there isn't an heir apparent based on who was there before. And I think it's interesting who'll come out of that.
Speaking of who comes out of it, we only have a minute, but let's do a little Nostradamus, starting with you, Michael. Who are the two finalists come November of both parties?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I'm not sure who's going to come out of the Republican side, because I think that there is, even as I talk to my Republican friends, they're not crazy about deal, and they're not shy to say that. So I don't know who will be that Republican nominee, but
Who's
I
the
do believe
Democrats?
I believe it's Mara Healey's race to lose. I believe she is the person that people have been waiting with bated breath that she step into this race. So I think it's Mara's race to lose.
Former federal judge, I think that Republican nominee, even though he's shown no interest publicly in the job, is the former U.S. Attorney Andrew Lelling. Who do you think the nominees are?
Well, I think he would be an interesting candidate. I think, he has, I think, an illegitimate reputation as a moderate when he actually was not. But that's the way he's seen. That he could well be the candidate. I have no idea. But I do agree with Michael that I think it's Mora's race to lose. And it would be great to finally break the spin in Massachusetts that a woman could be governor. That would be a hoot.
Well, we've never elected one. There was Jane Swift, but we've never elected one. Let's go from Democrats on Beacon Hill to Democrats on Capitol Hill. It's been a year of tough odds and slim margins for Joe Biden and his allies in Congress, who have a narrow majority in the House and an even narrower one in the Senate, thanks to a very important tiebreaker.
The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative.
There has been a $2 trillion COVID relief package, $1 trillion roads and bridges infrastructure plan, and votes to keep the government from shutting down or defaulting on its debt, both hard-fought battles in themselves for whatever reason. But dysfunction and divide are everywhere, even on an insurrection that threaten the lives of elected officials of both parties, including a vice president. And even when something does get passed, every single Democrat has to vote yes, something one man in particular hasn't gotten the memo on.
He will not have my vote. I will not support a reconciliation package that expands social programs and irresponsibly adds to our $29 trillion in national debt. This is a no on this legislation.
Over Manchin's and a few others' objections, including Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema, seen her giving a thumbs down to a $15 federal minimum wage, there's not much action in sight on a number of top Democratic priorities, including climate change, childcare, healthcare, and paid family leave. So, with midterms around the corner and a slew of likely defining issues, from the latest COVID surge to the weaponization of critical race theory and the former president jockeying for political influence, even as New York prosecutors jockey for a possible criminal prosecution against him, what is 2022 likely to have in store? You know, Michael Curry, the Democrats do have the power with no Republican votes to pass Build Back Better, but much more importantly, from my perspective, is voting rights protection, which they also could pass without one Republican vote. What's the consequence for Democrats if they failed to pass those two voting rights bills?
Well, I know we were on a call just this week with national NAACP leaders across this country. We were looking forward to advancing a voter rights protection bill. We were looking forward to the George Floyd justice and policing bill. We were looking forward to key pieces of legislation, even the Build Back Better plan. So I think there's a frustration with the Democratic Party, and particularly with our West Virginia friend who is not stepping up at this time. I think he's listening to others that may be contributing to his campaign and not listening to his voters, his constituents who are desperately in need of the resources that Build Back Better would provide.
You know, Judge Gertner, my sense is the federal courts have been fairly friendly to the reform, for lack of better expression, of voting laws in a couple of dozen of the state legislatures. Is your sense in the next year that the federal courts will be friendly to what I see is disenfranchisement in a lot of states?
I don't think that we can underestimate the impact of the change at the top. Linda Greenhouse wrote a column this weekend talking about weaponizing the Supreme Court, and that their behavior, particularly since Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation, has been like a drone strike, identifying the issues that they care about and lining up the votes and taking positions not based on precedent, but because they can. They have enabled gerrymandering. They have decimated the Voting Rights Act. And they show every indication of being like that going forward. Now, there will be judges across the country that will disagree, that will argue that will take positions rather against Republicans' effort to structure the elections in their respective states. But the Supreme Court's ultimate determination will cast a pall on everything else. I don't think you can underestimate this. And I keep on saying this. This court is doing what it wants because it can. And that is extraordinarily difficult. Every court up until now had to deal with middle of the road positions, Democratic positions. These people don't, and they won't, and they've shown every indication of doing whatever they want.
Well, here's what you said about that court. Here's what a member of that court said about that court. Here's Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor, obviously referencing the debate around the Mississippi abortion law.
Will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts?
We're only 5 or 6 months away, Judge, from a determination of the court on whether or not they essentially got a 50-year precedent in Roe v. Wade. One, what will they do? And two, if they do gut or repeal outright Roe v. Wade, what does that do? The conventional wisdom is that's a huge boon for Democrats come midterm elections. What's your response to both?
First of all, I don't think that there's any doubt that they will undercut Roe v. Wade. The only question is how. Whether they will reverse Roe v. Wade outright and say, as Justice Kavanaugh said, let the states decide, which is exactly what we fought a civil war not to have. In other words, no protection for this federal right at all. Or alternatively, they can simply they can continue the process of undermining Roe v. Wade. So it's not reversed outright, but suddenly it's now a 15-month prohibition. After 15 months, abortion is prohibited. They could gut that.
15 weeks.
15 weeks. I'm sorry. That would be a very long pregnancy.
Sure as hell would.
I think that everyone knows what they're up to. So even a diluting of Roe v. Wade, I think, certainly creates an issue around the country. I think that it will mobilize the Democratic Party. It will mobilize women. What I'm curious about is I actually think that the next step will be, constricting contraception. And then the question is, will we be mobilizing a new generation of women who will now see fundamental choice being undermined? But I do think it will mobilize people.
Michael Curry.
I think that's a good thing because the Roe v. Wade demobilized a movement, and that movement will mobilize again.
Michael Curry, you haven't sat on a bench, but you've argued in front of them. Do you share the judge's analysis of where this court's going? And do you also share her analysis that it is a mobilizer potentially to overcome the conventional wisdom that the Republicans take back Congress?
I think the judge is absolutely right. I try to remind my friends that elections have consequences. And we saw that in Shelby v. Holder. And we will likely see that when it comes to Roe v. Wade. If we don't show up, if we don't vote, there is a price to pay for that. And I think the direction that we're seeing the Supreme Court go in is not a surprise. It is what people have promised to deliver in a Supreme Court. So I agree. We need to mobilize. It should energize the base of folks who want to protect Roe v. Wade, who want to protect voting rights. And I'm hoping we come together across all of our different organizations to really speak up and speak loudly against this action.
In our final minutes, let's stay on your legal skills. Judge, first with you, there's a Manhattan district attorney who's leaving his job soon, who's been investigating the Trump operation. There is an attorney general in New York who has been investigating the Trump operation. There may be an attorney general of the United States investigating something about what appears to me is the worst lawyer of the three of us, is at minimum aiding and abetting an insurrection on January 6th of last year. Do we end 2022 with Donald Trump facing criminal charges in any of those three jurisdictions?
It's hard to say. Those three jurisdictions are appropriately pausing. We don't mean just sort of metaphorically before they indict Trump. because, what we saw with the impeachment actions, what we saw with the Mueller report, they have to have their ducks in place before they do. Because a missed shot again, a missed, arrow against Trump, just metaphorically again, would have terrible consequences. So I'm not troubled that we're not hearing about grand jury stuff, and I'm not troubled that they're not touting what they're doing, because if the one thing that we've learned is that extreme care has to be taken with this step. But I think we will hear certainly from Vance and Letitia James. I'm not so sure about Garland. The stuff coming out of the January 6th committee, I'm not sure how much it goes directly to Trump, although, frankly, it could. I mean, in other words, under usual criminal law principles, it certainly could, but I don't know whether they'll take aim at Trump.
How about you, Michael Curry? We have a minute.
Yeah, I'm hopeful, but I do know that people have been sort of traumatized by all this Trump stuff, right? We almost, even when you hear people who have frustrated with the January 6th hearings and the process, they almost say, okay, enough with this already. We want to stop talking about it. When in fact, we just, are giving Donald Trump and his allies exactly what they wanted, which is we become frustrated with the conversation. I am hopeful. I've talked to members of the committee. I'm hopeful that they will find what they need to. And if there's a direct tie to Donald Trump and other members of Congress, that they'll be prosecuted and held accountable. But as the judge said, you don't shoot it unless you make sure that you'll hit, because the reality is it'll empower that side of the country that supports Donald Trump.
Michael Curry, Nancy Gertner, you've been major contributors to this year on Greater Boston. I thank you both for that, and I hope we see a lot of you in a happier and healthier 2022. Thank you both for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Be well. That's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Happy Christmas, happy holidays, and as always, please stay safe.